So, James, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. We're going to dive right in. Now, your expertise is really in the realm of systems thinking, disruption, anticipating big challenges, and how massive changes in society are going to impact us. In the work that I've been doing recently, we've been researching the universality of challenges faced by young people around the world who want to take action but don't always know where or how to start. And in this early stage scoping, I sent out a survey to a number of my friends from different countries, asking them, what do you feel are the biggest kind of barriers, perhaps in mindset, that your peers are facing and that you yourself have faced? And unilaterally, the single most cited challenge or self-limiting belief is that the system is too broken to create meaningful change. What would your response to that be?
I would agree. I think, but probably for different reasons. So I think, we are essentially in a system, and we use the term the organizing system, and then we use that to describe the sort of political, social, economic systems, the governance structures, institutions that kind of manage and influence society. So that organizing system is really, at some level, an industrial age relic, right? I mean, this system kind of evolved out of the late medieval period, through the Renaissance and the Reformation and the early age of science, and it still exists today, pretty much in the same format. The idea of democracy, free market capitalism, the kind of social contract that we have today. These are all kind of constructs that kind of co-evolve with those industrial age technologies. But I think we're beginning to see a new system emerge, a new sort of system of production emerge. You see it in the in information technologies, where you have a totally different model, much more decentralized, based on entirely kind of different principles to the old industrial age model, and we're beginning to see that in energy, and we'll see that in food over the next decade or two, and various other sectors of the economy, and I think that the challenge is that our system is kind of deeply embedded. It kind of forms our most deeply held beliefs. I mean, the idea of kind of nation states and democracy and free market capitalism they're almost the sort of fundamental truths of our age. They're not things that we question, but they are essentially human constructs, right? They're conceptual frameworks in some ways, and they've worked extremely well. Unfortunately, we don't think they're particularly well matched to this system that's emerging, and we're seeing signs of breakdown. And I think as time goes by and that system of production, that new system of production emerges, it's going to become increasingly less well matched, and I think ultimately that system has to break down and be replaced by another.
And so, where was your curiosity first sparked? When did you first become aware of the constructs to which we find ourselves beholden, and perhaps the kind of absurdity of them? And when did you decide that you wanted to unpack them further, whether it was through RethinkX or before that point?
I spent a lot of time, working on kind of environmental issues, over the last 15 or so years. And I think it's very clear that we have kind of serious environmental problems. But I think, I began to get frustrated with some of the solutions that were suggested, behavior change, policy, regulation, and so on, as kind of answers to this. For me, it's those kinds of solutions are really kind of sticking plasters. They're really aimed at patching up this old system. And it became more and more apparent that actually, that's not a longer term solution. That's not a way to solve this. We can patch it up and keep this industrialized system going, but it's still the same model. It's still a model that's inherently unsustainable.
What are some specific examples of that kind of like patching up that you refer to?
We could very happily give up, say 50% of consumption. And that's, a valid solution. That if we give up 50% of our consumption, the social impact of that is so deep and profound. The idea that we can impose that on society is I think just not a viable or realistic solution. And more than that, actually, it's kind of, at some level economically illiterate. I think, if you cut consumption by 50%, the impact on investment and the availability of capital in the system will be such that, we'll never enable these new technologies that can potentially act as a solution to kind of grow and come through and allow that new system of production to emerge. And I think that's, for me, that's really the challenge, is that, say we reduce 50% our consumption by 50%, okay, you'd push out the date at which we breach, our environmental limits. But you'd only push it out by a decade or two, perhaps. You're still in that system. You're still adding huge amounts of, greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So it's not a long-term solution. It's a kind of patchwork solution that actually might kind of trap us in that old system.
Why are we so attached to that mode of thinking, do you think, and so attached to maintaining that status quo?
I think it's just the way it's always been. I mean, we've seen that in previous civilizations. The idea of the democracy, or the idea of a nation state, as deeply ingrained as perhaps the divine right of kings was in a previous era. And what we've seen in previous civilizations is that as things begin to break down, as they reach their limits, and for whatever reasons, whether it's salinating the soil through irrigation or destroying the topsoil or whatever it might be, they tend to turn backwards. They tend to kind of double down on what they perceive to have worked previously. And so you get more sacrifices or more priests or more soldiers or whatever it might be, but they never make the changes required.
What would you say the equivalent is now? What are we sacrificing or willing to sacrifice?
Well, I don't think we're willing to sacrifice anything. I think that, the idea that America might give up on the concept of America, or we might give up on the concept of democracy or capitalism or free markets. We don't see that happening. And, so what's happened historically is that, you've had breakdown, what we can achieve and what we can do, and our kind of way of life has dropped, and you've had a dark age essentially, and then centuries later a new civilization's kind of found a way of harnessing technology and that organizing system in a better way, and broken through to a kind of higher level of being. The challenge for us is how do we avoid breakdown and enable a kind of new system to emerge?
Is there any way of avoiding breakdown, or is it just the
extent
of the
breakdown? I absolutely think there is. What we have is some extraordinary technologies coming along that have the ability to transform society. What technology does is technologies manipulate matter, energy, and information. They're the foundations of the physical world, and technologies manipulate those to do the things we want. We're now at a period where we've got technologies coming in energy, in materials, matter, essentially, food and so on, and in information that are, allow us to operate at a whole different level. They're completely kind of decarbonized. They're hugely efficient. It's a different model. The model we've had essentially through the history of civilizations been essentially a model of extraction. I mean, that's how we term it, which is, what we have to do is harness resources from as far afield as we can to feed and provide for our populations. And it's a sort of breakdown model. So we grow plants and animals, or we find resources and we break them down into the things we need. And what's happening with the new technologies that are coming through, whether they're solar or the new food technologies, or the new information technologies, we think of it as a model of creation. So rather than breaking down materials into the things you need, you start from the molecular level or the electron level or the photon level, and you build up. And all the things we need for this new system are kind of available locally. So we don't need to harness them from huge areas. We just build what we need. So it's a vastly more efficient system that we're building. But it's also a completely different structure to that system. We're not in a world of scarcity necessarily when we move into this world. These things are all available in abundance. So that sort of competitive dynamic that we've seen through the history of civilization sort of unwinds. I see the solutions in these technologies, but my fear is that our organizing system, our governance structures and so on break down before that new system could emerge. Because it's a system that will largely be fully automated. We look out 20, 30, 40 years. And so we're going to have to rethink, our social contract, what we do, how we kind of reward or spread the benefits of this system. And if we try and manage that through the current system, through this industrialized system, we've got no hope.
I would love you to speak a little bit more about what needs to then happen on a deeper level. And you've spoken to these kind of social contracts, how do they need to change so that we can create the space and the environment for these systems and technologies to emerge in a very constructive way that serves the many, rather than perpetuating a very top-down hierarchical model, which is largely based out of Silicon Valley, and flourishes on the concept of socioeconomic inequality, disparity, exploiting a certain group of people and resources and whatnot.
I think we've seen extraordinary progress. I mean, our capabilities today compared to a couple of hundred years ago are just extraordinary. And the benefits of that have been relatively largely spread. I mean, the people living in abject poverty now are far fewer than we've ever seen before. Everyone, huge amounts of the world have access to education and healthcare and clean water and shelter and so on and so forth. So there has been a huge improvement in living standards. But the problem is that a lot of people have been excluded from that, and we've created huge wealth in very small pockets. And I think that's a challenge of the system. I mean, you get a few big winners, and left completely to its own devices, free market capitalism would deliver huge inequality. But it's kind of the job of regulation, of policymakers, essentially, to redistribute that, or to counterbalance the adverse effects of that. But we can only ever go so far in that process, because we're in a competitive world. If you go too far, you kind of kill the incentives to progress. You need those incentives to drive the entrepreneurs. And we found that when we've gone too far, communism, for instance, it's just those countries that have adopted that fallen behind and essentially had to adopt this kind of Western model that's kind of spread across the globe now. So there's a kind of Goldilocks zone in this system, and that's worked fine to date. But I think as we come into this new system, what we're going to see is if we try and manage these new technologies, through the old system, we have, essentially this new system's based on information. If you think that, the new food system, for instance, we're going to have localized production. We're not going to have this sort of massive scale agriculture we have now. We're going to have much more localized production, but we're going to exchange ideas. So you might develop a new protein and, I'll download your protein, your idea locally and have it produced locally. So we think of it as a kind of network and a node, a global information network, but localized nodes, which are kind of self-sufficient communities that can essentially produce what they need. That's a system of production. But the problem with that system is that we allow people to own both the platform, the network, or essentially we keep, information privatized. We're going to have huge inequality, and it's a real kind of winner-takes-all dynamic. In some ways, we every part of the system kind of needs to change to adapt to this new reality, including, how we govern. Do we govern at a kind of nation state level? Well, to be frank, that's not really an optimal, unit of governance anymore. It was in the industrial age. You needed kind of the scale, and you needed that kind of size. You don't in this new system. We need sort of rules at the network level and rules at the node level, but not at the sort of interim level.
It's intriguing when we look at widespread kind of disruption and largely, people feeling super disenfranchised by the future and these governing bodies that you're referring to, especially with, greater sense of scarcity, but also growing populations. And we're beginning to see people almost like opting out of the system. On some level, that's, deciding that I'm not going to vote in the next political process because I say it's too broken, it's too messed up. On another, it's blatant evasion of rule and regulation when, you have people in America with stupid amounts of money basically sending it all offshore, and you have an entire economy that is operating basically like in the ether that continues to perpetuate that broken model. Yeah. How do you begin to enable people to opt into a different system? How do you even make that visible?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's gonna emerge over the next few decades. I think what we've seen is that these things aren't kind of centrally planned. What you can do is kind of enable or create the conditions for that new system to emerge. We'll experiment. We'll find a winning combination that's much better matched to this new system of production that's emerging, and that system will just outcompete our existing system as we kind of run into the problems. These new societies, I think, will just begin to outcompete, and they'll essentially get ahead of of these industrial age systems that we have now. And this is why, in some ways, that you never see, a leading civilization of one era, becoming the leading civilization of the next era, because there's too much resistance to change within the leaders. They're just essentially their mindsets are too kind of frozen. The old system's too embedded. So it's always someone on the edge, who doesn't have that kind of baggage of incumbency, who kind of tries everything and breaks through. And it's that's exciting for the parts of the world that haven't done so well out of this, this old system.
Absolutely. And I think that's sort of what we're at risk of overlooking when we talk about systems and complexity, is identifying that there are key individuals within each of these institutions and systems who have not only benefited from the system being configured in that way, but actively evolve them as such, and in their minds have everything to lose from that disruption. And that's when you see power being clung onto. And so without being reductionist and saying it comes down to, a handful of individuals, we do need to create the space in that canopy for, exactly as you said, those on the outside or on the fringes to kind of shoot through, and to be able to bring a very fresh and different perspective. And I think we've also kind of seen that in the context of young people stepping up in the face of the climate crisis. When I work with students in the classroom, we do these kind of imagination exercises, and they try to imagine alternative futures and whatnot. And once you get through a lot of the kind of mindset barriers, the vision of what is possible is so much more expansive and creative and exciting. And yet doing that same exercise with a bunch of executives around a table, it's, like pulling teeth almost, because, not only are they jaded, but they've been embedded for that system for so long that it's that much more difficult to be able to envisage an alternative reality, a different future, a better, brighter future that serves the majority. And so, you've referred to historic disruption. What would you describe as some of the key kind of moments of disruption in history, and what are the opportunities specifically and the positive tipping points that have emerged from some of those moments?
Well, whenever a new kind of system or a new civilization breaks through it, it's a time of, immense opportunity. And at that point, the future possibilities just expand dramatically. You go from this kind of constrained system where, things kind of are carrying on as before, to one where, the outcomes just explode, or the potential outcomes just explode. And I think we're coming up, towards one of those points across society. I mean, we've seen that, that kind of process happen at a sector level, that over periods of time. So you think as cars began to replace horses, for instance, in the transportation system. I mean, that opened up extraordinary possibilities, and we saw whole cities being redesigned around the car.
What was the time frame of that transition?
Well, I mean, it was extraordinarily quick. So if you look at the US, I mean, I think in 1905 you had about 3% of the vehicles on the road being cars. The rest were essentially horses. And by, 1925, just 20 years later, it was over 95%. Oh. I mean, incredibly quick transition. And if you kind of go back to the beginning of that transition, the barriers seemed extraordinary. I mean, there were no roads, really, no paved roads. There was no oil industry. None of the kind of infrastructure you needed, no supply chains. These cars were kind of handmade. They were hugely expensive. They didn't work very well. I mean, and no mechanics, none of the kind of, the aftermarket kind of stuff that you needed to make a viable industry. And no one knew how to drive either. I mean, there were huge barriers. And yet, all those things turned out not to be kind of constants. They weren't barriers indefinitely. They all changed, and they all changed rapidly. And in 20 years, that whole system was replaced, and we went into this new system.
Should have stuck with the horse and carriages.
But the horses and carriages had huge environmental problems. I mean, there were huge issues in cities. I mean, there were articles projecting that by 1920 or so, New York would be under, I think, 13 meters of horse dung.
Wow.
That you had these diseases and you had carcasses lying in the streets and so on. I mean, it was a miserable time, and the car actually seemed to be the solution to the environmental problems of the day.
You touched on a really important point, because I think, as you highlighted, so much of the thinking around sustainability is embedded in that kind of mindset of sacrifice and also regressing. And so often the default is, okay, well, we need to go back to how things were. overlooking the myriad problems that came with that and not appreciating the progress that technology has enabled and allowed us and the privileges that it has allowed us. So it's then figuring out, okay, what comes after that? And so with the example of transport, how do you see that industry being disrupted? How do you see it changing?
I mean, the first one and the kind of the most obvious one is just the replacement of gasoline cars by electric cars. And we're seeing that going apace. The volume of electric cars sold every year is picking up, dramatically, exponentially. And that disruption is going to continue. And we're going to see, electric cars, replacing gasoline cars. But that's kind of a 1-for-1 substitution. It's not, necessarily the longer term solution. But what's happening as well, and this is a sort of tandem disruption that's coming a little bit behind that disruption, is when you add autonomy to the electric vehicle, you get autonomous electric cars, and you can have what we call transport as a service. The idea you don't own your car anymore, you just kind of access an autonomous electric vehicle when you need it. And the cost of that form of transportation, we think, is going to be a fraction of the cost, maybe even a tenth of the cost of owning your own car. And so we think people will move over to that very quickly once it's good enough. And it's, we don't think it's that far away from kind of hitting the streets, and we've already got pilots running in cities, and it's not too far away. And when that transition happens, we think that can happen within a decade or so. Over time, we're going to see human drivers as just, a huge liability, hugely dangerous, and you might lose a kind of license to operate your own vehicle. But, the point is that this disruption could happen hugely quickly, driven by the economics, not driven really by anything else. That this new system is just, cheaper and better than the old system, and that's kind of what drives disruption. The cost and the capability of the new technologies, and that then has huge implications across society. It changes the kind of the basis of geopolitics. It changes how we design our cities, where we can live, how quickly we can commute. It changes huge environmental impacts and so on. In our work, we're trying to highlight, look, we've got this wave of disruption coming. Transport's just one of the many sectors that are going to be disrupted. And we need to rethink the whole social contract.
And how are you guys rethinking those social contracts? Because I think that's whenever I get the weird kind of uncomfortable feeling in my stomach when I think about exponential rise in technology, it comes from exactly that. What about all of the people who are being left behind? What about all of the people who are kind of stuck in this sort of limbo and are forgotten by the system? And I think a lot of people respond to that when we begin to speak in like these sort of like techno-utopian type terms. So how do we best navigate that, and where is your thinking on that front? So
it's a massive challenge. I mean, you fast forward, 2-3 decades, and we think we'll see the system of production largely automated, and with it, most jobs. And I think historically what we've seen is, technology's tended to create as many jobs as it's destroyed. There've been issues with that, as I kind of referred to earlier. I think what we're seeing now with artificial intelligence particularly is actually we're not going to be creating these jobs will be gone. It's certainly in the way we think of jobs today. But what's exciting is that the cost of the things we need, energy, food, transportation, so on, are going to plummet. I mean, they're going to trend towards zero. I mean, it's going to be incredibly cheap to produce the basic things that we need. And so we might end up having a society where we have a right to those things. We have a right to 10,000 miles of transportation, or 2,500 calories a day, or whatever it might be. And it's kind of a step on from the concept of a universal basic income. Now and then we'll have freedom in the sense that we'll be kind of freed from the drudgery of production in some ways, that we'll be free to do far more creative things with our time. And when you have your basic needs met, it gives you incredible freedom to kind of do whatever it is that you might want to do. And that's what I mean by a kind of new social contract. Our social contract today is that we trade our labor for capital, essentially. We get paid for work. We have this kind of incredible world that's potentially opening up. But it will mean that we have to rethink, things like reward. I mean, we can still carry on trying to earn more money, but actually, once your needs are met, it kind of changes your, I think perspective in kind of ways we can't even foresee. But the challenge is, how do we get there? And that's the issue I think we're wrestling with is you can see what the end state might look like, and you can see where we are today. But as we go through that, there's going to be huge dislocation. Before the cost of the things we need get to the point that we can provide them. I mean, a universal basic income is just unaffordable today at a level that allows people to support themselves entirely. So what does that mean as we move through that period? So in some ways we do need to patch up the old system, to put those sticking plasters on it, to keep it alive long enough for this new system to emerge. But that's really the challenge for us: is how do we do with that, and how do we deal with the dislocation that we see as we transition?
Well, that's it. And the very nature of disruption is that it's hard to anticipate, right? It's hard to predict what those trends are going to look like. And critically, what that bridging looks like, as you highlighted. You can create the vision over there with the perfect kind of conditions, but figuring out where those pockets of the future are in the present and how to kind of blow them up exponentially is very difficult. So what's your methodology or approach for trying to do that and trying to anticipate the change that is inevitable?
We very much look at how disruptions have happened historically through the lens essentially of complex systems. And I think that's part of the problem that we have in society today, is that most forecasting is done on the basis of kind of what we'd term a kind of linear extrapolation. So if we want to forecast the future, what we tend to do is look back to the past and kind of draw a straight line today and then kind of extrapolate it out into the future. And that can work when you're in a period of kind of incremental change. So if you think of the transport system, we've essentially had the same system since, 1920s or so. For 100 years, it's been this system based on, individual ownership of a gasoline car and so on and so forth. And so, back in, say, 1960, if you'd predicted 20 years ahead, that kind of linear extrapolation wouldn't have been a bad proxy or a bad kind of estimate of what was to come. The problem comes when, you think out disruption moves in S-curves. You get kind of a long period of incremental change and then these periods of rapid disruption. We kind of expect everything to continue as it is, and it's really a problem from science in some ways. That the way we conduct experiments is to hold one to isolate one variable and allow it to change, and we hold all else equal, we hold all else constant. But the real world's not like that. One variable changes, it ripples across the whole system and can change everything. And so in a complex system, understanding when those periods of disruption is kind of critical. What we're seeing is we have a series of technologies that are getting to the point at which they're becoming competitive with the old ways of doing things, and have the potential to be 10x cheaper within a decade or two. And that's a recipe for the disruption. So we think every sector of the economy pretty much will be disrupted over the next decade or two by new products and services that are cheaper and better than the old ones. The real failure of forecasting is that it kind of leaves you driving blind into the future. But if your expectations of the future are based on a kind of linear extrapolation, you really have no idea what's coming, and you're making plans for the future based on wholly unrealistic expectations. And that's a massive challenge for society, that we just don't see what's coming. And so we see our work in some ways as trying to provide alternate scenarios, so at least we kind of see what's possible, and so that we can begin to plan for that. Because right now we feel that governments, that Wall Street banks, that NGOs, you name them, they're all producing these essentially linear forecasts, and leaving all decision makers, whoever they might be, and the public more generally, completely unprepared for what's coming.
And on the positive side, I think we begin to see some of those exponentials in terms of grassroots movements. And, looking back at last year and the number of young people who took to the streets in protest of climate inaction and demanded more of these institutions of power, I could not have anticipated, I don't think anyone could have anticipated how much momentum was going to be created on the ground and how much of a catalyst that was going to be for lots of big businesses, policymakers, individuals within these massive organizations having their kids come home at the end of the day and say, what are you doing about climate change? I don't think that could have been anticipated. And so we see these kind of like little glimpses of what is possible when that exponentiality is made possible by lots of people kind of coming together. And equally, as you said, if our projections to the future are all based on looking to the past and being stuck within this very linear mindset, there is so much that is possible once we expand that open, even on an individual level, thinking about our own personal capabilities. When we adopt that kind of breakthrough thinking and we establish a goal for ourselves and say, okay, but what would that look like amplified to a factor of 10? And so could you speak to that a little bit and what you feel is the kind of mindset that we need to carry forward to not only be able to navigate this complexity and these problems and perhaps maintain the emotional resilience to be able to deal with increasing disruption, which I think is what a lot of young people today are really, really struggling with because there is just so much uncertainty about the future and that can paralyze us, but also how to begin expanding what we can imagine is possible and how we can begin projecting and opening up our creativity and imaginations.
It's hugely exciting what's going on. I mean, I see these pockets of activism and this kind of generalized kind of discontent with the system actually is hugely positive. I mean, I think there's a general acceptance that things need to change, right? And we don't quite know how. Actually, we don't need to know how. Those people who want to stop change happening and want to keep us there, and that's always going to be there. Always has been there. Right. We can't expect that to disappear. But what we can do is kind of, in some ways, declaw it. Make it less. Less of an issue, and we can, whatever we can do to remove the effects of incumbency can only help, the new system to emerge. And I think, just keeping an open mind and just keeping curious and trying to understand that, I guess the complex interactions across society, the fact that, we're all connected in some ways, and that ideas spread virally, and that, new concepts and new ways of doing things can scale incredibly quickly in this kind of globalized information system that we have. So we'll need the new thinkers and so on and so forth, but we'll also need, the new models, new ways of doing things that we don't quite know what they are or where they're coming from, but we just need to try and experiment. And I think that sort of activism we see is, a wonderful thing. And I think it's, it's that kind of level of curiosity and determination to try new stuff that's going to enable this new system that we're talking about to kind of bust through.
And it's about becoming sort of comfortable with absurdity and this idea that so much in our society is just construct, right? Yeah. Our very grip on what is real and what is not real begins to slip. And I feel that the only way to be able to create the space for that mentally, emotionally, is to sort of distill down to the core values that are universal truths, whether that is the need for love, compassion, belonging, community. And I suppose those values are what need to serve as our kind of compass as we navigate, because otherwise it almost becomes too fluid, if that makes sense.
Change is terrifying, right, at every level to most people. We get kind of comfortable with the way things are. And I think, that's what leads to these kind of reactionary forces that we see people wanting to kind of reach back. You see it in American politics today. You see it in UK politics, actually. You want to go back to kind of past certainties. Yeah. But those certainties don't exist anymore. And I think, getting comfortable with change and getting comfortable with uncertainty is kind of critical. And it's a really tough thing to do because you're right. How do you guide yourself through a period where all the kind of, the signposts and the guideposts have fallen away? I think as we move into this kind of new system, it becomes possible. You're not in this kind of hugely competitive environment. You're not in a world of scarcity that you kind of have to exploit or be exploited, or dominate or be dominated. You're in a whole different world here where there's enough. Everything is available, energy and matter and information available in abundance. In every kind of jurisdiction.
What do you feel needs to change about our perception and our humanism, to be able to create the space for those possibilities, because so much of the story we've been told about one another is embedded in a place of scarcity and competition and survival of the fittest and dominance, So how then do you recognize and ignite in individuals all of the positives and the reality that the reason why we've been successful as a society is our ability to be social creatures and to work together and collaborate and rally around fictions and stories? How can we reclaim that narrative?
I think it starts by stripping back the old narrative, right? That we have to realize that these old narratives and these old structures and these old systems that we've grown up with and have been constant through our parents' lives and our grandparents' lives and so on, that these are just constructs, that these are just human constructs and nothing. There's nothing more than that. And stripping back all our kind of perceptions that stem from that. And really our whole way of seeing the world. It's kind of, trying to sort of deprogram ourselves in some ways so that we can then, almost become a blank canvas. And that's a really tough thing to do.
There are the pockets in psychology that really excite me are, things like cognitive behavioral therapy. They only really touch the surface, but that was very powerful for me as someone who, used to experience real anxiety and panic attacks and things, was, for one, just becoming an objective spectator to my own feelings and realizing that they weren't necessarily truths, but they were stories that I was perpetuating. And in fact, I had the ability to reclaim that story and write another better story that served me for the long term, Yeah. And so I feel like on an individual level, that's super important, right? Is unshackling from these individual stories that we tell ourselves, but also the social stories about, succeeding for the 9 to 5. And exactly as you said, your worth, your value as an individual distilling down to the hours that you put in at your shift. So unhooking from a lot of that. But I realize as well that comes from a place of enormous privilege, because I don't have to walk an unconventional path. And from like a community perspective, I have two very supportive, wacky parents who have always said, you can do whatever you want. You don't have to go to university. You don't have to go and work for a corporate behemoth. But I realize that so many young people going through the education system, that is what they're consistently being told, be it by their parents, be it by their communities, their teachers. And so I suppose so much of it does come down to that mindset, though. How in your own life have you found yourself unshackling from some of those stories? And what has reminded you of what's important, or in those times of disruption, what have you kind of drawn back to give yourself a little bit more perspective?
I've suffered, as you have, from anxiety previously, and all kinds of issues, I guess, and I think it all stems from kind of fear, at some level. And you're right, we tell ourselves all kinds of stories that are unhelpful to each other, and we kind of expect the worst in the future. And what you realize it is a sort of process of deprogramming that we were talking about before, that you have to kind of strip back those stories and tell yourselves new and more helpful ones. And I think at a societal level, that's kind of where we need to go. I find that I have to constantly challenge my own thinking, that we all come, and me particularly, with all kinds of preconceptions about how things work, and you have to challenge every single one of them all the time, and you have to keep a kind of curiosity alive. I think, and it gets it kind of gets harder to do as you get older. I think it's a real challenge to kind of get comfortable with change and kind of embrace change.
I suppose that's the opportunity of something like the climate crisis, right? Because suddenly the level of perceived loss shifts away from me as an individual, my immediate family, to holy hell, we're looking at the future of our civilization, of every species, of our planet, of whether my children are going to have a future and whether their children will be able to experience the same things that I have in my lifetime. So it can actually be quite an effective lens, obviously, to rally people to action, because suddenly the focus shifts from the comfort of me to, okay, but what about the well-being of the whole?
I think you're right to some extent, but I think also that the stories we tell about the climate are terrifying, right? And they're paralyzing at some level. That we just see this monumental risk coming down the track a decade or two ahead, with no obvious solutions, and just it really makes people on the one hand terrified and either want to hide from it, or it becomes sort of paralyzing. I think more and more we're seeing people kind of wanting to take action, but what that action looks like is kind of really really hard to see. And I think that's we do ourselves a disservice by focusing on the fear side too much. Ultimately, the only solution, or the only long-term solution to climate crisis is in essentially the new technologies that allow us to use energy without impacting the environment. And I think that's a challenge. And we kind of see energy use as bad, and it's not bad. It's energy use has been a huge benefit to society. It's the carbon emissions or the greenhouse gases that come with energy use that are bad. But we have a fully decarbonized energy system that is cheaper than the existing one and better than the existing one, more resilient and secure than the existing system. That's an amazing thing, and we have that on the horizon. I mean, solar now is the lowest cost form of energy in most parts of the world. And it's just a case of scaling now, and we're well on the way. We think we're at the bottom of that S curve, about to fly up it. You'd be mad today to build a coal-fired power station, for instance. There's a perception that solar and renewables are more expensive than there's a cost to society to transition to clean energy. It's nonsense. I mean, there's a cost to keeping coal going. If you're building coal-fired power stations, you're going to lose a lot of money as an economy or as a society. I mean, there's no doubt about that now. And so you're building them not for economic reasons, for other reasons. And so it's hugely exciting that these solutions are there. And I think focusing on the optimism and seeing that path to solving the problem, is hugely beneficial. I think we're seeing it in the food system as well, where these new ways of producing complex organic molecules, proteins and fats and so on, that we can produce them through essentially a process of fermentation at a fraction of the cost that you can, get them from animals or even plants, is hugely exciting, because it's a system that has almost no impact on the environment, very little land use. Free up huge swathes of farmland that you use to grow crops or pasture land for animals that we can do other things with. We could reforest, or we could do all kinds of things with that can help suck greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So I think that's the potential to solve climate change is there, and we often don't see it. And it's really a case of getting on and embracing it. My fear is some of the solutions we have motivated by that fear, like giving up consumption, are actually going to lock us into the old system. They'll tank the economy to such an extent that we have no money, no capital to invest in these new solutions, and we'll just be locked in the old, and it'll be a complete disaster. I mean, the future is here to see. I mean, it's there. We're only a decade or two away from a fully decarbonized food system and an energy system and transportation system. The three biggest emitting sectors of the economy, and that's massively exciting.
It really is.
But we just don't tend to see it. We focus on the fear, and I think that's, for me, that's a mistake.
You raise a really, really important point, because it's something that I observe every time I go into Twitter. These incredible thought leaders and super inspiring individuals who are leading change, and yet continue to share these super catastrophic news stories about what's happening with the crisis. And I recognize the importance of awareness, but in all the research that I've done to date, that imbalance in how we tell this story has detrimental impacts, because it perpetuates this dystopia that so many young people are now subscribing to in the wake of protest and in the wake of short-term kind of activism, when there isn't a clear path forward and they're asking what next, and And we have a responsibility in the sustainability industry, in environmentalism, in the spaces of social justice, to tell better stories and to craft those narratives and to make available and expose the solutions that are there and these kind of tipping points, and introduce that as a concept, as you said, to say, this isn't something of the year 2100. This is something available to us within the next 10, 15, 20 years, but we need individuals to step up with initiative to be able to drive them forward. How can we create stories that are better and that serve us better, but also that individuals can project themselves into in a realistic way?
I heard Elon Musk talking about this a while ago. What he said was, there's a saying we have in society, where there's a will, there's a way. And he said, that's wrong. It's framed the wrong way around. It should be, where there's a way, there's a will. Meaning, if we can see what's possible, we'll find the will to get there. And I think he's absolutely right. I think what we don't have right now in society is the kind of the positive vision of what's possible. We have a lot of doom and gloom. Most of the solutions are somewhat backward looking to let's get back to kind of how, the way we did things when things were better, which, to be honest, are, I think make no sense whatsoever. We've got the potential of reaching an entirely kind of better and more positive system out into the future, but we don't see it. And I think if we can paint stories and paint the picture of kind of what's possible, and also an understanding that it's actually achievable, it's going to happen. I mean, we're on the path there already. This is not something that requires huge intervention. I mean, the market largely will deliver a new energy system, a new food system, a new transport system. The challenge is how do we allow society to cope with the scale of change that's coming? And so if we can paint that positive picture, I think we'll find the will to get through it. It's sort of the light at the end of the tunnel.
And I love Jonathan Porritt's work for that reason, especially the book that he wrote, The World We Made, which is written from the perspective of two students in the year 2050, looking back at how we solved the climate crisis. And it's done in a really compelling way because it acknowledges what we are going to lose, and which is almost kind of inevitable in terms of that widespread disruption, in terms of, massive collapse in the food system. But it really highlights the individuals who stepped up to that challenge and made a conscious effort to say, I'm not going to sit idly by and watch this happen. I want to be a custodian of a future by my own making, and I'm going to try and achieve the impossible. I'm going to do what has never been done before. And it's that sort of like radicalism and also that naive optimism, which I feel is such an essential kind of ingredient in this in this equation as we move forward. I would love to hear more examples or thought provocations around how to develop solutions that really meet people's needs and that place people at the center. Because again, so many of the solutions currently presented to us are faulty because they're based on the premise of behavior change. It's based on, people going out of their way to change behavior. And it's a very kind of myopic way of thinking about the problems and the solutions. What I love about, companies like Impossible Foods is that, when we were working in the marketing department, at no point did we say we're going to call this like a vegetarian product or a vegan product, that it carries too much baggage. And it suggests that we're trying to prescribe a different way of living and existing and consuming. We want to meet people where they already are with a product that is just as good, if not tastier, that also makes them feel really good because they see that it's a fraction of the environmental impact. And we see how incredible those kind of solutions are and their ability to disrupt in a very positive way on the wider kind of picture. So what are some of the kind of stories, solutions that you've also seen that encompass that, where we're meeting people in a way that isn't about, giving things up, but it speaks to improving your well-being, your state of mind, and it's very much like an invitation rather than a sacrifice.
Yeah. There are businesses across the board that are doing this. I mean, Impossible have been a great example. They've scaled unbelievably quickly, and they're producing something that's essentially indistinguishable from the sort of animal-based alternative. That process is well underway, and we're seeing it across all kinds of other areas of the food system and across all kinds of materials. We're seeing clothing produced in this way. We're seeing people making palm oil, for instance, or at least the active ingredients. You can make the cannabidiol from the cannabis plant in this way. And so you don't need to produce a whole plant. You just produce the active ingredient, right? So there are There's incredible promise in these new technologies to kind of solve almost any environmental problem we want. And it's here, it's happening. But over time, as the cost gets low, it will replace every kind of organic molecule, and we won't produce anything, through the traditional kind of breakdown or extraction method of production. And so, the challenge really is how can we accelerate this? How can we, if there are really pressing issues like palm oil or whatever it might be, can we accelerate the production of these things? I.e., make them competitive before, the market would deliver the solution. So can we, can you produce synthetic palm oil? What can we do to kind of accelerate some of these solutions? Bring them forward in the timeline. And I think there's tons that can be done. I mean, we just have to identify it. But most people aren't aware of these solutions and aren't aware of how close they are to hitting the market. And there's almost nothing that's kind of unsolvable now. It sounds like this is a kind of techno utopia at some level, but it's not. I mean, these technologies are here and they're ready. And it's now just a case of getting them out into the market and scaling them.
And critically, it's about where the vested interest lies, right? I think any of these technologies can very easily be appropriated by individuals if you're looking at them from a very top-down approach that is still embedded in this sort of like dominion mindset about controlling people and controlling that supply chain. But if you flip that equation to, as you were saying earlier, it coming from the ground up and it being an emergent, and the very people who are developing the solutions are also the beneficiaries of those solutions, then it completely changes that entire kind of landscape in a really exciting way.
It does. And it's, it's super exciting. I mean, that, if you think of materials that we can produce, in this manner now, biologically, essentially, if we run that system through our old system of IP rights and so on, you're going to have an industry that looks like the sort of pharmaceutical industry, where the, huge development costs, huge approval timeframes, the regulations will kind of restrict and hold back the market and impose, enormous cost on the system. It doesn't have to be like that. This is not like pharmaceuticals. So there's huge cost to drug discovery and testing and so on and so forth. You have school children developing molecules now and their science projects, and so the costs are plummeting. It's becoming super cheap, almost free to develop a new molecule that can be used in whatever way you want it to be used. And so if we have a much more kind of open source system, a much kind of freer system, and we remove some of the regulatory barriers, then suddenly you have a system that can just explode, and you have a system that's much more broadly shared and so on. And that's that's the challenge, is how do we get the old, stop the old system killing this new system? Because there's a real risk that happens, but there's also an enormous opportunity there as well.
Absolutely. And I realize that a lot of this can seem very theoretical. What would your invitation be to people who want to begin solving for the problems that they care about really deeply? Part of the work that we do in classrooms, which is the most essential kind of part of the formula, is helping young people distill down to the problems that they want to see solved, because we have a tendency to kind of like spread ourselves thin across lots of different causes. But ultimately, as you well know, impact comes from focus. It's drilling really, really deep, understanding everything that you can, going into it with a lot of humility, asking many questions, maintaining that curiosity. What would your invitation be for people as they begin to step up to the challenges in terms of how to adopt a sort of holistic, systemic mindset and think through this lens of possibility and learn to love the problem rather than the solution?
We need, many more of these kind of scenarios depicting, what's possible. It needs to be much clearer to people, what is happening in the kind of technological, the industrial space, how that system is changing, and that information is just not available, because often those, the solutions to what seems like an intractable problem is actually on the horizon, and it's not a problem that needs, widespread behavior change or regulation or whatever kind of suite of solutions that we've used in the old system. It's actually about a whole new system that's going to emerge anyway. It's not about, it's not about reductionism and, individual parts and silos is about connections, essentially. And I think that's really the challenge that we face.
And human connections and becoming intimate with the very real human impacts of these problems on people's lives was something that I was speaking to Anna Jones of RefuAid about on the podcast, because she was talking about the failure of big incumbent organizations like the UN in trying to solve the refugee crisis, because so much of their own bureaucracy kind of got in the way. But in the case of Anna, just actually being on the ground at the time in Lesbos and asking people who were arriving what they needed, whether it was, shoes or clothes or, a Wi-Fi connection to be able to connect with their families, and then extending that further, what they needed once they were here assimilating in the UK to feel stable and secure. Just having those conversations is what enabled them to create real legitimate impact. And I think it's what we can kind of forget in this equation is you need to become intimate, and you need to be okay with asking lots of questions and not knowing the answer to most things as you set out in trying to deal with complexity and these kind of challenges and overwhelm and all of the baggage that comes with.
Yeah, I mean, you just nailed it. I mean, that's exactly the issue. The whole industrial age in some ways has been about the individual. The individual rights, one of the key concepts that underpin democracy and capitalism, private ownership of property. I mean, these are all about the individual. But actually, the connection between individuals is even more important. I mean, none of us are isolated. None of us operate in a silo.
And so, if we pivot to being a little bit psycho-spiritual for a second, we're both part of an inquiry into energy consciousness and technology. Have you had any breakthroughs in thinking so far? No pressure.
I wouldn't say breakthroughs. The act of thinking happens unconsciously, mainly. That you expose yourself to ideas and expose yourself to information, and you just kind of let it settle. I'm at the point now where I'm kind of piling in information and ideas, and it all looks very cloudy right now, but it's that's not frightening. That's to be embraced, and you just have to let it settle, and the clarity will come eventually.
Well, I think we're also, as humans, we're great pattern recognizers, and my greatest kind of like breakthroughs in thinking are when I'm consistently downloading information over a long time, usually years, and then suddenly you identify the trend and you're like, well, this person said that thing to me, or that person gave me that bit of advice, and now it makes total sense, like where the synergies are. It's the nature of kind of peeling back the layers, and again, getting that kind of like depth of focus that we were talking about. Because when I first came into the world of climate change, it was very much as like a self-proclaimed environmentalist, and it was all about environmental justice. And I used to get asked, well, do you care more about, people or the environment? And back then I actually had an answer for that. I said, well, I'm motivated by the environment. And yet, obviously, now at this point, it's like, okay, well, they're so inextricably connected that you can't separate out any one problem, nor can you separate out any one solution. It's understanding the relationships more than the parts themselves, which is so exciting and which creates those kind of glimpses of insight and foresight. And so in line with that, I mean, I would love to hear more about this report and what some of the kind of like top level themes are. And then, how this inquiry that you guys have been on at RethinkX has perhaps evolved your thinking, or how it's going to propel you into the future and change the way in which you look at these problems.
It's really kind of looking through our framework at how the world might develop, 20, 30, 40 years into the future. So it's very high level, but it's also looking back, 10,000 years and more to, through the history of civilizations, really, to understand, how the system we're in today has kind of emerged and evolved, and what that might mean, what we can learn from the lessons of history and past civilizations about where we might be going in the future. So we start at a kind of sector level of the economy, and we look at how sectors have been disrupted over time, how the car replaced the horse, and how it happened very quickly, and how there were incredible implications across society. If you look back in history, occasionally you have changes that actually require a whole new organizing system. So you look back to Sumerian civilization or Babylonian, Egyptian, Roman, and so on. Each civilization represents almost an order of magnitude increase in our capabilities. So you start off with cities of 10,000, and the next civilization gets to 100,000. Rome hit 1 million, and now we're in the tens of millions, and you get this kind of this step change increase. But the organizing system that supported a previous civilization is not capable of managing society when you have an entirely different production system that's operating at much greater scale. And I think so. When we look at where we are today, we see an industrial age organizing system, essentially governing and managing society. And it's done an incredible job over the last 200 or so years. It's allowed us to develop extraordinary capabilities. But what we're seeing now, and certainly in the information sector, which is a sort of the leading edge of the of a new system that might be emerging, is an entirely new system. The information revolution of the last 2 or 3 decades has changed the structure. This centralized system that we've had, where a few newspapers or a few TV stations or a few radio shows or whatever have kind of acted as a kind of central conduit for information sharing, being replaced by one where anyone can kind of produce and consume media, at almost zero cost, and that's transformed the model. And our essentially our organizing system can't cope with that anymore. We can't govern that. Can't. How do you regulate Facebook? How do you regulate Google through our old governance structure? You can't do it at a national level. It just doesn't work. And we're seeing problems now with that information system in terms of the democratic process, the ability to kind of corrupt the process of democracy, but also with the ability to influence how people vote and so on. That actually these things are coming into conflict now. This new information system is not well matched to our system of regulating, governing, and organizing. And we're going to see the same thing happen with the energy system and the food system and the transport system, as they completely decentralize in the same way. And we have much more localized production. And we think that this industrial age system is essentially going to stop functioning before too long. And the challenge for us really as a society is how do we enable that system to emerge without a breakdown of our organizing structures that lead us, essentially dropping back into a new dark age.